Hello, everybody, and welcome to the zapForum podcast, recorded on December 20th, 2007, the title of which is The Management Discipline of Service-Oriented Architecture, with our guest, Dr. Uli Kelix, VP of Product Line Management at Alphabet. In this podcast, we've definitely spent a lot of time on the ZapThink site and in a lot of our research and a lot of our writing and definitely in a lot of our speaking, talking about how service-oriented architecture is an enterprise architecture discipline that is just as much business-centric as it is technology-centric. Obviously the goal of enterprise architecture is to meet the continuously changing needs of the business with a flexible and agile set of capabilities on the other hand. Now, given that we've talked about that a lot, we also caution people saying, well, you can't really buy service-oriented architecture. You have to do service-oriented architecture. But at the same time, we have to find a role to get the management and the business side involved in service-oriented architecture. And one can actually make a good point that without appropriate business management and IT planning, you could certainly get very fast into the weeds of service-oriented architecture. You can build services that don't meet the needs of the business, or even worse, build services that are competing with each other for basic capabilities to do this. So a lot of redundancy. So clearly, good business planning, good business management, good modeling is part of that good enterprise architecture set of best practices. And this is what makes architecture different from simply development. So we're going to define that today. Now, on this podcast, it's for the ZapThink side, just me here, Ron Schmelzer, senior analyst here at ZapThink, because Jason Bluebergs, he's been doing a lot of training and teaching, and he's actually on the road right now, flying back from London. And my good colleague Dave, he's also out there. We've been a very busy bunch here at ZapThink. So it's been left to me to get this podcast ready, but I'm going to give you a very exciting podcast, our last podcast for the year, and this should be pretty exciting. So just want to introduce now our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Uli Kelix, who is the VP of Product Line Management at Alphabet. And basically, just as a way of introducing him, when discussing service-oriented architecture, many enterprises tend to think of primarily the technical side of things, design, testing, deployment, management. But as you know, service-oriented architecture as an EA discipline has some very classic management decisions that need to be made around service-oriented architecture. For example, figuring out which services to invest in, which services will advance the strategic goals of the enterprise, what is the business case around those services, and how do you control and manage the risks that enterprises incur by implementing those services, and of course dealing with governance. And those things have very little to do with the technical aspects of SOA, but if they're not addressed, many of these SOA programs will have very little value for the business. And actually, we don't really want SOA just to be a technology discipline anyway. So clearly, good SOA efforts have very intense planning and phases that basically help to prove the business strategies, goals, and demands. And of course, SOA starting in the business is really very important for companies. Companies who are most successful do this well, and companies who fail to recognize this really have a hard time with SOA. So on this topic of IT planning and IT strategy and EA management, IT alignment with the business principles and best practices, we have Alphabet. And for those of you that are not familiar with Alphabet, Alphabet is a company that provides software that acts as a process framework for IT planning. Basically, it's focusing on providing information base that enables and manages transactions among organizations, processes, and information with the goal of aiding communication and collaboration. It's a mouthful, but I'm sure we'll understand a little bit more about it as we get through some of the questions and expertise here of our expert. Product is called Planning IT, which addresses specific needs in SOA implementation. But without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Uli Kelix. Thank you for joining us here on this podcast.
Hello, Ron.
So I guess really my first question to you is, what are the main issues and activities that we're talking about when we talk about the management side of SOA as opposed to the technical side?
I think it starts off with the million-dollar question, which area in the business should I really be considering for deployment of service orientation? Because on the one hand, you probably don't have the resources available that can bring service orientation into the enterprise on a broad footing. You definitely don't want to do this if your architecture is significantly large. And Hence, you need to prioritize where to start off with. Also, there may be areas where you don't really see any value add in providing the agility that service orientation brings alongside, and the investments that you have to take to restructure your existing application landscape have very little chance of ever paying off. Now, what approaches can companies take, and how is that related to enterprise architecture management and IT management? Hence, is an interesting question. So, one approach that you may want to consider as an enterprise is looking at your business architecture from the perspective, where do I have my core competencies? Where do I have contextual activities? And contrast this with an understanding of mission criticality. And any subset of your business activities that is core on the one hand and mission critical on the other hand is constituting very good candidates for service orientation, opposed to, for instance, areas where you are more contextual in nature of the activity and still you are mission critical, where typically you would prefer following a standard software configuration type of solution strategy. So it is really looking at your business, talking with the folks in the business units, getting a common understanding as to where are our core competencies, where do we have the highest innovation potential in the foreseeable future, where do we want to put our strategic emphasis in outpacing the market, and contrasting this with the mission criticality.
Well, this sounds obviously like a very critical and important task. I mean, this sort of brings up the question: what sort of methodologies is this a methodology issue? Do people know how to do this? And of course, who in the organization is responsible for doing this planning and strategy?
I think you're right. It is a methodology issue on the one hand, but it is also an information issue, and it is clearly a collaboration issue, because there is no single instance in the enterprise that can take these kind of decisions. There's no magic team that can provide this type of guidance to the enterprise. It is really a collective collaborative decision-making process that need to be started here. And it's typically following a hierarchical assessment where enterprise would, on the top level, look into maybe 15, 20, 30 domains of top activity descriptions, identifying the ones that are core and mission critical at the same time, and then taking these to the next level of detail where the same exercise would be repeated. And obviously, the top level, the team that is assessing top level may be very different from the teams that are assessing the second or third level of detail. Some point in this hierarchical assessment, the enterprise is going to hit the level of activity that is readily available for service orientation. That is another advantage of this approach, because it guides the enterprise to a common understanding and common description of what are serviceable activities, which obviously is addressing a second topic that you mentioned in your introductory talk, that is, how do I avoid redundancy in the service landscape that I'm establishing?
That certainly sounds very, very broad. A lot of roles in your organization, a lot of people. And it's interesting that you say that there's really no magic team, there's no magic group, because certainly some people are trying to set that up. But so stepping back a little bit, when people talk about they're getting all wrapped up, and they're thinking about web services, or people talk about but they're really talking about web services integration. We say there's a huge difference. Web services integration is a technical thing about providing standards for interoperability between systems. And service-oriented architecture as a discipline is an architecture for managing the continuously changing assets of an organization, regardless of how they're implemented in regards to business process. So when you're thinking about this, people aren't really thinking about the business issues. I guess for those who aren't thinking about it, what can you tell them about why are these business issues so important when implementing SOA, and what kind of risks are incurred, if we think about SOA solely from this technical perspective?
I think, at least from what we are seeing with the customers and prospects that we are talking to that have started addressing service orientation from the technical perspective, that have started service orientation on an operational level, inevitably these companies end up in a very chaotic situation where at one point in time they really start asking themselves the question, so what services do I have, and how many of these services do I have, and what are the differences between the services that I have, and is there any overlap between these services? Because that is the situation already today in the traditionally architected enterprise. They have the problem that there's so much redundancy between the different applications that they are operating to support the business. And with service orientation, that problem actually is going to magnify because the number of moving parts that you have in your architecture is going to increase by at least one order of magnitude. So in that situation, companies really have to very consciously take a pause, take a stop, and look at where are in building our service-oriented architecture. We are not proposing to tear this architecture down. On the contrary, it is reflecting which services do we have, how are these services interrelated, which domain do they belong to, which business activities are they actually enabling and supporting, and how can I use this as a nucleus to expand and more comprehensively cover the critical domains in the business architecture.
So let me ask you this. We talk about service-oriented architecture as if it's this new thing. Nothing really existed similar to SOA before, and things that exist similar to it afterwards. But of course, we know that's really not the case. SOA is really building upon other enterprise architectural as well as technological movements that have happened before. In your opinion, when we're talking about this business management side, is there anything that we can do in SOA that we can borrow from something before? Are there other maybe methodologies, other approaches that you think are relevant to SOA?
We clearly see that there is a lot of commonality between the governance aspect that I need for service orientation, which is basically what we just spoke about, with the general architecture governance and IT governance that need to be established in the enterprise. You want to have the same rigor for your budget decisions in traditionally architected environments as you want to have them in service-oriented architecture environments. You want to have the same rigor in understanding the architectural consequences of proposed solution architectures, no matter whether this is following a traditional paradigm or a service-oriented paradigm. You want to have the same rigor for risk assessment in both these disciplines. And you have the same need to communicate the plans that you are making into the organization so that other people that are planning in other parts of the organization are fully aware of the plans that you are making, and they are not making any duplicate plans. They are aligning their plans with what is to become the future according to your plans. This is what enterprise architecture management is all about, and this is why service-oriented architecture governance is, in our understanding and in our experience, a subdiscipline of enterprise architecture management.
I think that's a good sign then. If we have some of these other disciplines and have some of these other approaches that are available to us, at least we're not reinventing all these wheels at the same time. We can borrow from some of this, and we can, of course, borrow from some of the best practices and hopefully some of the successful experiences to do that. Now, clearly we're talking about management stuff, and people are still thinking a lot about the technology side. Are these completely different? Are these completely separate? What can we do? How does the management and the technical sides interrelate and complement each other? Other than just the fact that we're talking about services that are implemented with technology?
I think that's a very good question, and in fact, this is an aspect that poses some new challenges to enterprise architecture management because the close-up between the strategic planning side of things and the operational execution side of things is particularly tight in the case of service orientation. And both sides can benefit from the fact that there is a lot of structural information management already available for operational service management. Most companies have an operational service repository of sort implemented, whether this is a homegrown or one that is being purchased as off-the-shelf software. It doesn't really matter. And there are clearly three integration processes that we can identify in the context of collaboration between the strategic decision-making arena and the operational execution arena. The first one that I want to mention here is operationalizing on plans that you have decided about in your strategic arena. So if you have approved a project that had proposed one or more new services being generated, and if you have provided the funding to this project, then all the architectural decision-making context from your strategy domain need to be passed on to the operational execution environment, where then this service is being created as one requested for implementation and undergoes a very distinct life cycle process from detailed design through implementation, through testing, through deployment, ultimately into runtime management, and maybe ultimately into retirement. And all along this life cycle change, which from the request of implementation all the way to retirement is managed and governed by the service repository, the operational service repository, need to be kind of linked back into the strategy arena so that subsequent planning and decision-making can acknowledge the progress that the implementation team is making towards operationalizing this plan. So this is the first workflow that we see. The second workflow is associated with what many call rogue services. So services that nobody ever has officially requested, nobody ever has officially given an approval for, but that have come into existence because a project here or there has taken the liberty to implementing such service. Even though I called them rogue, they may not in all cases be a bad thing. What is important is that the strategic level where you want to take the decision, which services do I want, and do I want a new service, or do I want to expand an existing service to embrace additional capability, need to be aware of the services that are being created on operational level. We also refer to this as the problem of mutual discovery, because we have basically two relatively independent instances that know about services, and they need to obviously have the same perspective to reality, to the one reality that I have in the enterprise. And the third workflow that we see is one of abstracting and aggregating performance information from the runtime environment of the service to reflect it back into the decision-making arena. Let me give you an example for that. Say you have a service that for whatever reason fails 3 times a week in your execution environment. That, when just being looked at in the execution environment, may trigger activity in the sense that somebody starts looking into how can I improve stability of that service, which would be a very myopic approach because you have no comprehensive understanding of the overall business context that this service is executed in. If the process environment that this service is being used is not all that important, is not really one that requires 24/7 availability, you may be happy having 3 service failures a week, but you may not be accepting a service failing even once a week if this is embedded in a 24/7 type of environment. So this is the reason why with our customers and prospects, we are looking into abstracting runtime information that is available in the operational service repositories and aggregating it up to levels that are accessible and understandable to business type of decision makers, which is clearly not the operational service repository. Now, that's a bit of a challenge because you really have a mass data problem here, but there are technologies out there, and all this is happening on the backdrop of enterprise architecture, which does provide such technologies of abstracting and aggregating information and re-representing it at a different level of decision making.
Well, that certainly is pretty comprehensive. There's a lot of things to think about in this sort of technical management overlap. One thing you kind of hinted about was about service redundancy and unnecessary services and rogue services. So what do you suggest as methods for both planning to avoid those things in the first place, but of course, how do you deal with those? Because it's almost like an inevitability that companies are going to build services that they're not going to find necessary. They're going to build services that are unnecessarily redundant with each other, or someone's going to build a service that has not really had the approval of management. So how do we avoid it, and how do we deal with it after the fact?
The first answer to this would be only once you know about these, you can do something about them. That means first challenge that you need to get your arms around is understanding what are the services that I have and how well are these aligned with the intentions that I have. Secondly, we recommend companies starting to build up a taxonomy of serviceable activities that describe what the enterprise is all about. Such serviceable activities would, for instance, be derived from this hierarchical assessment process along the domain hierarchy of the enterprise, which ultimately is going to lead to a level of description for business activities that are considered granular enough to describe potential business services, which doesn't mean that you have taken any decisions to instantiate any of these potential business services as actual business service. But it allows you at least to then map the services that you do have to this strategically intended service map and understand how well are they actually covering this intention, and where do I have to make adjustments for the actual service to better align with the strategically intended serviceable activities.
Sounds like the so-called service domain or the service catalog or it's really the logical organization of services as they are planned to be developed. I think that sounds like that's key to making that work. So before we sort of talk a little bit more about some of the details of actually putting this into practice, what is the role of governance in all this?
I think governance plays a very important role here, as you need to make sure that you align your organization along one common set of processes. You need to make sure that everybody understands where are the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities in that process. As you need to make sure that you have transparency as to who has taken what decision in the overall process, so that as and when situations occur where people are unhappy with the situation and with the decisions that are taken, you know whom to go back to and question as to what the reasons were for taking that decision. And it also allows you, because you have repeatable processes, because you have transparent processes and reliable processes, it allows you as an organization to learn from the successes and failures that you encounter on the way to service orientation. So process is really key, and you cannot establish a process without a satisfactory information base that can support the process, and you cannot be successful in executing the process without the organization being in place that is aligned along that process. And that obviously is a bit of a change to some organizations, because IT organizations oftentimes are not very process affine. That is something that IT organizations have to get used to. They have to get used to in any case, because increasingly there is a challenge to IT organizations to organize themselves like businesses, to behave internally like businesses, right, to manage IT like a business. And all that is only possible if the IT kind of gets this process orientation.
Well, that certainly makes sense. Now, we've talked a lot about a bunch of things. Let's talk a little bit about your company and how you're putting this into practice. So first of all, tell us a little bit about Planning IT and what is a product. I mean, we talked a lot about methodologies and approach and people and process rather than technology. So what is the role of technology here in Planning IT to support SOA planning?
The role of technology is relatively simply stated, one of providing exactly this information system, the information management system, that can support the relevant processes, and providing a framework which enables enterprises to setting up and executing these processes in a very distributed, heterogeneous, collaborative environment, with typically hundreds, if not thousands, of stakeholders being involved within the IT organization, but also importantly outside in the business units.
So as a last note, I mean, what are some of the EA best practices that you're seeing used in the context of SOA, and how do people use Planning IT to help facilitate those best practices?
One important element I think I already mentioned is this hierarchical assessment, taking a strategic perspective to things that you are doing and aligning your operational activities with this strategic perspective. A second one is very clearly that you want to articulate your plans for the future. You need to let people know that I am currently planning to introduce this new service, and it's going to be productive. If everything is going according to plan, it's going to be productive in 3 months from now. And it is going to have the following non-functional characteristics. And it's going to be used in the context of the following business processes. This is providing foresight to your peers in the organization so that they know and they can assess as to whether or not they can reuse the service that you are offering in the business contexts that they are responsible for, or whether they should rather be looking into an additional service or an expansion of the service that you are currently implementing so that it can embrace their requirements along the way in a likewise fashion.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Uli, for joining us on this podcast. This certainly was a lot of food for thought, and for those of you that are still thinking about the role of business in service-oriented architecture, hopefully this has given you something to think about. So thank you very much, Uli.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It's a pleasure talking to you. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining us on this podcast. Of course, wish you all a very happy holiday season and a very prosperous, enjoyable, fun, whatever goals you have for 2008. I hope they're all being met. And of course, I hope you continue to stay tuned to the information and the content that we produce here at ZapThink. We are enjoying the over 30,000 people that we now have working and listening and paying attention to our zapForum podcast. So thank you all very much, and hope to join us on a further one. Thank you.